I'll call the Honourable Member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak on Part 3. This is an important part because it deals with the question of accountability and oversight, the Intelligence and Security Committee. And I want to speak to my amendment on Supplementary Order Paper number 313. Why I've moved this amendment is to basically give the committee greater ability to inquire into these agencies, because currently the committee has a lot of constraints on it. If you think about a regular select committee, if it is to be able to do its job, it needs to be able to inquire into the agency that it's working in. And currently, under the Intelligence and Security Committee Act, there's all these constraints. So, for example, the functions of the committee do not include inquiring into any matter that is operationally sensitive. Now, what this means is that basically it's the minister can say this is something that's operationally sensitive, so you're not allowed to look at it. Now, you might think, well, okay, you wouldn't want the secrets to come out, but if the Intelligence and Security Committee, operating essentially in secret because it meets in a closed session, cannot inquire into the operations of the GCSB and the SAS, then nobody else outside of the Prime Minister from the democratically elected Parliament can inquire into the operations. This is actually particularly important for the issue that was raised in Parliament today, which is around whether the GCSB is in receipt of money from the United States government. When I've asked written questions to the Minister responsible for the GCSB as to whether the GCSB has received money from the US government, and particularly the NSA, the Prime Minister has refused to answer these questions on the basis that these are operational matters and he doesn't comment on operational matters. Now, we know from the United Kingdom that the equivalent of the GCSB, the GCHQ, has received something in the order of £100 million from the US government in order to do the work of the US spy agencies in Britain. We can only assume that the GCSB, the New Zealand spy agency, is also in receipt of money from the US government. We can't prove it. We don't have the evidence. We don't have Snowden's leaks to show that they've been getting money from the US government. But when we've asked questions about it, the Prime Minister has blocked us on the basis that it's operationally sensitive. That's why my amendment on this part, which basically gives the ability of the Intelligence and Security Committee to ask questions about things that might be operationally sensitive, is important. If we cannot even ask whether the GCSB has been getting money from the US government, if that simple question is blocked by the Prime Minister on the basis that this is operationally sensitive, then we can't ask some basic questions about the GCSB. Because if the GCSB is in receipt of many millions of dollars of US government money, and we can't prove that it is or it isn't, but clearly the equivalent in the United Kingdom is, so why wouldn't the equivalent in New Zealand also be receiving US government money? I mean, there's a logic to this thing. The NSA is giving out large amounts of money to its Five Eyes partners. It's given a whole bunch of money to the UK. It makes sense that it's also given a whole bunch of money to the GCSB in New Zealand. If we can't ask those questions because they're blocked by the Prime Minister on the basis that they are operational matters, then it becomes incredibly difficult for the Intelligence and Security Committee, let alone Parliament as a whole, to do its job to keep the GCSB accountable. And that's why I've moved amendments under Supplementary Order Paper 313 to basically give more power to the Intelligence and Security Committee to ask these questions. Because when, obviously I can't talk about what happens inside meetings of the Intelligence and Security Committee because it's under the statute on which it operates, it's an offence to reveal anything that happens inside the meetings, even though I've been on the committee now for 5 years. But essentially, if you look at the statutes under which we operate, the GCSB can always block us asking questions on the basis of operational sensitivity. And so that's why it is very important that we remove this section from the Intelligence and Security Committee Act so that we can ask those questions, because we can't even get into the basic financial situation of the GCSB. You might think, well, the Intelligence and Security Committee, well, they can't ask questions about who they're bugging, but surely it should be able to ask questions about the financial situation of the GCSB. but we can't even ask questions about the financial situation of the GCSB. Are they, for example, in receipt of large amounts of money from the US government? Because when we ask those questions, as I did in my written questions to the Prime Minister, he blocked the answers to those questions on the basis that they were an operational matter. It seems to me that whether the GCSB... Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It seems to me that the question of whether the GCSB is in receipt of large amounts of money is an issue of financial review as much as anything else. And so how are we meant to operate the powers of financial review over the GCSB on the SIS if we can't even ask questions as to where their money is coming from? Whether it's coming from offshore, whether it's coming from the New Zealand government, we are not allowed to ask those questions. So under some of the improvements, and there have been some improvements, some minor improvements, and I've acknowledged those previously, of oversight, one of the minor improvements is that the financial review sessions are meant to operate in public. This is an amendment that Peter Dunn managed to get up, and it is a small improvement. But you realise how small the improvement is when the financial review discussion of the GCSB, when it's meant to be happening in these public sessions, when we won't be allowed to ask, or at least we won't be able to have answered, some basic fundamental questions about where the money comes from, even under the marginally expanded financial review powers which Mr Dunn has got put into this bill. Because we can't ask them the question of where the money comes from, where their income comes from. Now, you might think, well, you know, it's just an act of generosity by the US government that they give the GCSB a whole bunch of money. It's an act of generosity that they've given the GCHQ in the United Kingdom £100 million. But if the GCSB is to be truly accountable to the New Zealand people, this is in fact a critical issue. Because there is a saying, isn't there? He who pays the piper calls the tune, right? That is one of the sayings. So when we are the people, as the taxpayers and the people of New Zealand, we're the ones who pay the money, then it gives us some control over the purse strings of the GCSB. Because we're able to say, no, we're not going to give you money for that if we don't like what that is, or we will give you money for X if we do like what X is. The problem is that if the US government is a major funder of the GCSB, and based on the evidence from the United Kingdom and the Snowden papers, it may well be true, who knows, the Prime Minister won't answer questions on it. If the US government is a significant funder of the GCSB, then we lose that level of control over the GCSB's functionality, because if they want to install a particular system that the New Zealand government and taxpayers simply does not want to pay for, then they can get funding from offshore to install those surveillance systems. Now, it kind of... I give you that on first hearing this may sound extraordinary. And when I first heard that the NSA had been funding GCHQ, the UK one, I could not believe it. And it was only when it was confirmed by the papers that Edward Snowden released that obviously revealed the true extent of what's really going on with the surveillance state, that we were able to establish that these large amounts of money were flowing from the NSA in the United States into the other Five Eyes spy agencies and presumably into the GCSB. So that's why this amendment, which might seem relatively small and perhaps not relevant to issues of financial review, actually is entirely relevant to the financial review function, because we cannot perform even the financial review function of the GCSB properly, because the Prime Minister is using the defence of operational matters as a reason not to answer basic questions, for example, the question of whether the GCSB is receiving money from offshore. There are a number of other issues that are related to this, and Mr Goff, I think, has done a good job in covering those. The fact that the Intelligence and Security Committee is dominated by government ministers, when in other jurisdictions government ministers can't be on such an oversight committee. The fact that the committee has limited powers of inquiry is a significant restriction. And of course, in other jurisdictions, members of parliament aren't on the committee to give it much more independence. All of these things could have been dramatically improved in the way that we dealt with this had we gone through a proper process, holding an inquiry into these agencies, so we could actually start from a sensible starting point of what kind of agencies do we want, what kind of oversight they should have, and then the law would follow from that, including the oversight of the Intelligence and Security Committee that we're dealing with under this part. The law would flow from such an inquiry, rather than us dealing with this bill in front of us, which the Prime Minister and the government are very keen to push through this Parliament. So, Mr Chair, I would say to the National Party members of the House, you should support this amendment to the bill. It's a constructive amendment to the bill so that we can do proper financial reviews of the GCSB, because currently we cannot, because the Prime Minister won't answer questions on them. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Chairman.